Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today we explain Exodus chapter 33 in a clear and simple way, step by step.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer magnitude of Exodus chapter 33, we kind of have to take a step back and look at the incredibly dramatic context of where we are in the story right now. Imagine this. Moses has literally just come down from Mount Sinai holding the tablets of the Ten Commandments, only to walk into a complete nightmare. He finds the Israelites worshiping a golden calf. Right? In this moment of just intense, overwhelming crisis, Moses shatters the tablets. Thousands have died in the immediate fallout. And you have to remember, this catastrophic betrayal happened almost immediately after their miraculous exodus from Egypt. So the covenant they just made is completely shattered. As we step into chapter 33, the air is just thick with this unbearable tension. Israel's entire future is hanging by a thread. And the core question hovering over everything we're going to talk about today is simply this. Is God going to abandon the Israelites forever? Or is there somehow a way to repair this totally broken bond?
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the crisis of presence, then look at the tent of meeting, see how Moses intercedes for Israel, explore the moment of seeing God's glory, and finally wrap up with some practical life lessons.
Okay, let's dive right into section 1, the crisis of presence, which covers Exodus 33, verses 1 through 6. The chapter kicks off with God speaking directly to Moses in verses 1 through 3. And God basically commands Moses to pack up and leave Mount Sinai. He says, "Depart, go up hence, thou and the people which thou hast brought up out of the land of Egypt." He's telling them to head toward that land he originally promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, in verse 2, God is actually promising them immense physical success and protection. He declares he's going to send an angel ahead of them to drive out all the nations in their way: the Canaanite, the Amorite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. He guarantees them this beautiful land flowing with milk and honey. Sounds great, right? But then, out of nowhere, comes this absolute devastating blow. God explicitly states, "For I will not go up in the midst of thee." Think about what that means. He's offering them the physical gift, the land, the military victory, the security, but he is entirely withdrawing the giver. The actual spiritual core of the promise, his own divine presence, is completely gone. So why would God do this? Well, verse 3 explains exactly what's going on. God says, "For thou art a stiff-necked people, lest I consume thee in the way." Now in Hebrew, this incredibly famous phrase is am kashe oref. To really grasp the simple meaning here, you have to picture ancient agrarian imagery. Think about a stubborn ox or a beast of burden that literally stiffens its neck muscles and just flat-out refuses to turn and be guided by the farmer's yoke. That's Israel right now. They are stubbornly refusing divine guidance. God is basically warning them that His holiness is an absolute, pure reality. If you bring that kind of absolute, burning purity into direct, intimate contact with intense, stubborn rebellion, the natural result would be their total destruction. So as crazy as it sounds, God's withdrawal of His presence is actually a paradox. It's a harsh mercy. It's an act of protection, so they literally aren't consumed on the journey.
And wow, the reaction to this news is just immediate and profound. Let's look at verses 4 through 6. And when the people heard these evil tidings, they mourned, and no man did put on him his ornaments. In verse 5, God formally commands them to strip off their ornaments so that he can decide what to do with them. And then verse 6 tells us, "And the children of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments by the Mount Horeb." By the way, Mount Horeb is just another name for Mount Sinai. Now, this collective stripping off of their finery, this isn't just a wardrobe change. It is a deeply physical act of total vulnerability, intense mourning, and massive remorse. They are literally stripping away the wealth they brought out of Egypt, choosing to stand completely bare, humbled, and totally exposed before the Creator. They finally realize that getting a promised land without God's presence in it isn't really a promise at all.
Moving on to section 2, the tent of meeting, looking at verses 7 through 11.
Because God's presence can no longer reside safely right in the middle of the camp, Moses has to come up with a temporary solution, which we see in verse 7. "And Moses took the tabernacle and pitched it without the camp, afar off from the camp, and called it the tabernacle of the congregation." In Hebrew, this is called the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. I want you to pay close attention to the physical geography here, because the text makes a point to say it was pitched afar off. That physical distance is a perfect, striking symbol of the new spiritual fracture between God and the people. If anyone wanted to seek the Lord, they had to physically leave their own camp and walk way out to this tent. And verses 8 through 10 describe this incredibly cinematic scene. Whenever Moses walked out to this tent, every single person in the camp stood at the entrance of their own tent, their eyes completely fixed on Moses in total respect until he went inside. And the moment he entered, this massive pillar of cloud would descend and stand right at the door. Seeing that visual manifestation, all the people would rise up and worship, keeping this deeply reverent but honestly heartbreaking distance.
Inside that tent, though, the dynamic was completely different. Verse 11 tells us, "And the Lord spake unto Moses face to face, as a man speaketh unto his friend." The Hebrew phrase used here is panim el panim. Now, to be clear about the simple meaning, the Peshat, this does not mean Moses was looking at a literal physical face. Rather, it means Moses had this direct, clear, unfiltered, and totally unmediated communication with God. There were no confusing riddles, no vague dreams, no intermediaries relaying messages. It was just a deep, profound bond of friendship. And it's really interesting, the second half of verse 11 makes sure to note that Moses' servant, Joshua the son of Nun, who was just a young man at the time, departed not out of the tabernacle. So while Moses would leave, Joshua quietly stays behind in the tent, just absorbing this holy environment. He's standing in that lingering presence of God, which is his amazing subtle preparation for his eventual role as the future leader of Israel.
Now we reach the climax of the chapter. In section 3, Moses intercedes for Israel. This is verses 12 through 17.
Armed with that amazing face-to-face friendship, Moses steps up to the plate and begins a really tense, high-stakes negotiation with the Creator on behalf of the Israelites. In verses 12 through 14, we see Moses methodically laying out his argument. In verse 12, he actually quotes God's own words right back to him. He says, "See, thou sayest unto me, bring up this people, and thou hast not let me know whom thou wilt send with me." Moses is leaning heavily on the favor he's earned, reminding God, "Yet thou hast said, I know thee by name, and thou hast also found grace in my sight." Now, knowing someone by name in this context signifies a really deep personal knowledge and a specific choosing. Then in verse 13, Moses asks to know God's way so he can continue to find grace, and he specifically slips in this reminder, "Consider that this nation is thy people." In verse 14, God partially yields. God says, "My presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest." But notice the catch. God says, "with thee," singular, as in just with Moses. But Moses knows that simply isn't going to cut it. The whole nation needs that presence.
So, in verses 15 and 16, Moses draws a massive line in the sand. He replies to God, "If thy presence go not with me, carry us not up hence." This is an absolutely incredible ultimatum. Moses is essentially saying he would rather die out here in the barren, dry desert as long as God is with them than live in a lush, beautiful paradise without him. Getting to the promised land means absolutely nothing if the Lord isn't making the trip. Verse 16 explains exactly why he feels this way. "For wherein shall it be known here that I and thy people have found grace in thy sight? Is it not in that thou goest with us?" Moses is arguing that without God's active, dwelling presence, there is literally nothing that makes Israel any different from any other nation on the planet. Having a guardian angel isn't enough, owning physical real estate isn't enough, their entire identity as a people relies entirely on the fact that God travels among them.
And you know what? The intercession actually works. We can feel this immense wave of relief in verse 17. "And the Lord said unto Moses, I will do this thing also that thou hast spoken, for thou hast found grace in my sight, and I know thee by name." Because of Moses' fierce loyalty, his direct advocacy, and that incredibly unique relationship where he found grace in God's sight, God yields to a human intercessor. He agrees that his presence will indeed go with the entire nation, not just Moses. The terrible gaping wound caused by the golden calf is finally beginning to heal. Moses has successfully saved his people from total spiritual abandonment. Section 4 takes us into even deeper waters, seeing God's glory in verses 18 through 23.
Having successfully locked in God's presence for the people, Moses decides to push the envelope even further in verse 18. Emboldened by this tremendous display of God's grace, Moses makes what is probably the most audacious request a human being could ever possibly make. He asks, "I beseech thee, show me thy glory." In the original Hebrew, this is har'ani na et kevodika. Think about it. Up until this exact moment, Moses knows God's actions pretty well. He knows the sound of God's voice, he's seen the incredible miracles, he knows his power, and he certainly knows his wrath. But now, Moses wants to actually perceive God's true essence. He wants a visual manifestation of the unclouded, pure reality of the divine. He essentially wants to know God as deeply and as fully as is conceptually possible for a human mind to handle.
God's response to this in verse 19 is just absolutely fascinating. He doesn't just say a flat no to Moses, but he definitely redefines what Moses is actually going to be allowed to experience. God says, "I will make all my goodness pass before thee, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before thee." So God is agreeing to show Moses his goodness, which represents his core character. And then he makes this profound, sweeping statement about his sovereign mercy, saying, "And will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." If we translate that into everyday English, God is explaining that his mercy is an entirely free gift. It can't be forced, it can't be bought, and it definitely can't be strictly earned on a ledger. God alone chooses exactly how and to whom he extends his grace, which perfectly emphasizes his absolute, unchallengeable sovereignty over the entire universe.
Right after making this beautiful promise, God establishes a very firm physical and spiritual boundary in verse 20. And he said, "Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live." Now, to be super clear on the Peshat, the simple literal meaning of this text, we have to understand that God isn't being angry or trying to punish Moses here. The best way to understand this is to compare it to walking outside and staring directly up into the midday sun. Right? It's not like the sun is angry at your eyes. It's just that the sheer, staggering power and radiation of a star are simply incompatible with the fragile physical limits of a human eyeball. It's exactly the same concept here. God's pure, infinite, totally unfiltered presence is so overwhelmingly powerful that any finite, mortal human being would simply cease to exist if exposed to it directly. It would literally destroy him.
So, to allow Moses to have this profound experience without, destroying him, God details a very specific step-by-step physical procedure for his protection in verses 21 through 23. God says, "Behold, there is a place by me, and thou shalt stand upon a rock." When God's massive glory passes by, he promises to place Moses in a cleft of the rock. The Hebrew term is nikrat hatzor, which is like a deep crack or fissure in the stone. Furthermore, God says he will cover thee with my hand while I pass by. Obviously, this is anthropomorphic language, meaning it's using human physical terms so we can understand something divine. The hand just represents a divine, impenetrable shield of protection. Finally, in verse 23, God says, "And I will take away mine hand, and thou shalt see my back parts, but my face shall not be seen." Seeing God's back basically means Moses is allowed to see the aftermath, the trailing edge or the majestic wake of his divine glory, while remaining safely shielded from the direct, lethal force of his face.
All right, let's bring it all together in Section 5, Practical Life Lessons. What do we actually take away from all this?
Now that we've walked step by step through this amazing narrative, we can extract some incredibly powerful, simple ideas for our own lives. First off, we learn a massive lesson about the nature of true leadership. Think about it. Moses could have easily just taken the deal. He could have gone to the promised land with his angel, enjoyed guaranteed physical success, and washed his hands of the whole thing. Instead, he stood in the gap. If you think of a modern manager at a company or a parent taking full responsibility for their team's or their child's failure instead of just abandoning them, that is what real leadership looks like. Second, we see that authentic presence matters more than anything else. Imagine a parent who buys their kid endless toys and gives them tons of money but is never actually present in the home. The true presence of someone you love is what actually sustains you, way more than any material gift. And finally, real intimate relationships allow for honest dialogue. Because Moses was a friend who spoke panim el panim, face to face, he had the safety to openly and honestly negotiate with God. The genuine bonds in our own lives, with our friends and family, are built on this exact same kind of clear, fearless, and honest communication.
So, let's just take a quick reflective look back at the incredible emotional roller coaster of this chapter. Following the devastating crisis of the golden calf, God threatened to completely withdraw his presence from the stiff-necked Israelites, which would have stripped away the entire spiritual core of their future. Moses immediately reacted by pitching the tent of meeting far outside the camp just to maintain some form of communication. Then, utilizing his totally unique, unmediated relationship, Moses successfully step-by-step persuaded the Creator to remain with Israel, flat out refusing to take a single step forward without him. This entire profound chapter then beautifully culminated in a spectacular but highly shielded encounter where Moses was safely protected in the cleft of a rock and allowed to experience a fleeting, awe-inspiring glimpse of God's passing glory.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to ponder today. If you were given the choice, would you settle for guaranteed success, or would you risk it all just for true presence? Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.